The protagonist was having an ordinary day. While driving his car, he noticed a message asking about the working conditions of guides. He inwardly scoffed, considering such questions a futile waste of time, as they never led to any tangible outcomes. However, upon discovering that the survey was confidential, he decided to respond to the questions. His initial satisfaction quickly faded when he realized there was an overwhelming number of questions. This started to irritate him. Determined not to let the situation drag on, he resolved that it was now or never to address the matter. One of the questions asked if there was anything about his work as a guide that dissatisfied him, and he wasted no time in providing his answer. Then, he let loose, vividly detailing how his Esper, a person he had to interact with daily and incessantly, was driving him absolutely insane. The protagonist mentioned that even full-time guides spent less time working than he did. The next question, however, required him to provide his name, and he felt deceived, as the survey was initially presented as anonymous. Let us get to know him better. Our protagonist's name is Kim Do-won, and he has been working as an on-call guide for 4 years. Yet, due to having to work with an arrogant Esper, he finds himself, despite living in the 21st century, leading the life of a struggling guide. Suddenly, the protagonist reflected on the fact that, in the modern era, guides should be able to freely choose between fieldwork, working in departments, or on-call assignments. For some reason, though, he was relegated to the latter and assigned to a specific Esper. The young man continued his musings. Field guides conducted their duties during operations and occasionally even accompanied Espers into battles. In return, they earned the highest salaries, along with lifetime benefits. However, the protagonist couldn't help but note that, despite the generous compensation, this field was ranked as the most perilous service, and since he valued his life dearly, he could never agree to such work. He then pondered about the office guides who worked in the central headquarters and were not assigned to any specific Esper. These individuals lived and worked in the office building year-round. He recalled hearing that these guides enjoyed decent working conditions and fair pay. Yet, in his mind, such a job was akin to hell, requiring them to work 3 shifts with relentless intensity. In any case, he was now an on-call guide. Such workers were also known as free guides, or freelance guides. In this role, he was required to remain available 24/7 and could not relocate as he pleased. He only went to work when summoned by the Esper to whom he was assigned. This was the sole type of guide that had the advantage of working simultaneously in multiple locations. When the protagonist obtained his guide certification at the age of 20, he unhesitatingly chose to become a freelance guide and enrolled in university concurrently. However, the fate of a freelance guide heavily depended on the Esper they were paired with. Now the protagonist had arrived at headquarters and inquired at the reception about his sunfish. For context, in nature, a sunfish is a species of fish often depicted in illustrations. This was the nickname the protagonist had coined for his insufferable Esper. The receptionist, puzzled, asked if she understood correctly that he was the guide working with Esper Cha-kwon-woo. When he confirmed, she directed him to Office 305, adding that the Esper was known for his diligence. The issue was that his Esper managed to summon him 7 times a week. Standing in front of the office, the protagonist realized how utterly fed up he was with the situation. He longed for a proper day off at least once a week. He even considered conducting today's session with his eyes closed. But he quickly dismissed the idea, recalling how his Esper always glared at him as if he wanted to kill him. In the end, the protagonist plastered on his brightest smile and flung the door open with a cheerful remark about how they had just seen each other yesterday. He tossed his bag onto the couch. Then, addressing the Esper again, he asked if he might be overexerting himself, even while taking care of his own health. The protagonist glanced at the Esper, internally noting the rumors that he had been through a grueling battle, which now seemed to be true. Cha-kwon-woo gave him a look so intense that it made him flinch. The protagonist silently remarked on the Esper's menacing gaze, then mentally scolded himself to focus on the task at hand and stop overthinking. He likened himself to an IV drip, silent, efficient, and ready to get to work. Upon reviewing the Esper's metrics, Kim Do-won was horrified. He wondered incredulously if this man was single-handedly saving the world, given how his guidance levels were almost always at 0. Regardless, there was no time to waste. The protagonist took the Esper's hand and announced that he was beginning the restoration procedure. At some point, the young man realized he had almost drifted off to sleep. He always left the sessions utterly exhausted. The protagonist informed the Esper that his exams were starting next week and asked not to be summoned, pointing out that full-time guides didn't work 7 days a week. Yawning, he mumbled that such intense work was completely unfair. Then he fell silent, realizing he had spoken the words aloud. Panic seized him as he feared Chakwan Wu might now be angry, leaving the consequences unpredictable. The protagonist turned to amend the situation, but he froze in place as the Esper approached him with a threatening, piercing gaze. Hastily, the protagonist stammered that he meant to say he would rush to him immediately after finishing his exams, then bolted from the office like a bullet. The next day, he dragged himself back to his sunflower once again. The woman at reception reminded him that it was Sunday, yet the Esper paid no heed to such trivialities and detained him for 4 hours, leaving him utterly exhausted. Kim Do-won recalled Chakwan Wu's expression, reminiscent of a professor chastising him for incomplete assignments, as his grueling workload had hindered his ability to solve problems. Suddenly, the young man overheard voices and noticed a group conversing nearby. Among them was his Esper, and he realized with surprise that, surrounded by his team members, Chakwan Wu interacted effortlessly. Kim Do-won grew curious, wondering why Chakwan Wu wouldn't speak to him at all. The protagonist understood that grievances should be voiced, yet he couldn't help but feel hurt by the Esper's silence. On his way home, Kim Do-won bombarded Chakwan Wu with messages but received no response. A week passed. The protagonist sat in confusion, unable to comprehend why the Esper hadn't summoned him. It was perplexing, especially since Chakwan Wu used to summon him thrice daily, treating guidance sessions like meals. Now not a single request had come all week. He became convinced something was amiss and even speculated that perhaps his device was broken. Starting with a simple solution, he decided to restart the app, but the oppressive silence persisted. Ultimately, the protagonist sought solace in a massive bowl of rice, richly garnished with eggs. He could only hope that no peculiar creatures had appeared and that Chakwan Wu was simply enjoying some rare time off, needing no assistance. It reached the point where he began scouring the internet for news of monsters attacking the city and causing destruction. The young man spiraled into a dilemma, questioning whether he was upset by the Esper's silence or secretly relieved to finally rest. Regardless, Kim Do-won was weighed down by the thought that such a thing had never happened before, leaving him certain that something was wrong. In the past, Chakwan Wu had summoned him without hesitation, even on Mother's Day and other holidays. Suffice it to say, the Esper had no qualms about calling him on his birthday, let alone the fact that the protagonist couldn't celebrate his beloved Christmas in peace. Kim Do-won suddenly considered that perhaps Chakwan Wu was being considerate, knowing he had exams. On that note, the protagonist concluded that Chakwan Wu was, in fact, an excellent Esper. Then he remembered that his priority was the upcoming exam on ancient hieroglyphs scheduled for the next day. He understood all too well that failing this exam would prevent him from completing his education. The next day arrived, and the protagonist headed to the university. As the exam began, everything proceeded smoothly until the device came to life. The protagonist thought that even if the world were ending, guidance would have to wait, and he continued writing his exam. The device kept signaling, and his irritation grew steadily. Finally, Kim Do-won decided to check who was so insistent and froze abruptly. The gadget alerted the guide to a red code emergency. He even questioned if he was imagining things. This was the gravest danger signal imaginable. Without hesitation, the protagonist grabbed his exam sheet, threw it on the professor's desk, and rushed out, his mind consumed with Chakwan Wu's perilous state. He was sprinting out of the lecture hall when the professor called out, reminding him that only 20 minutes had passed since the exam began. The protagonist explained he had received an emergency guidance request and hoped for understanding. The young man rushed to answer the Esper's call, fervently hoping he wouldn't die. Statistics flooded his mind. On average, 10 Espers per year met their end. He tried to reassure himself with the knowledge that Chakwan Wu possessed an exceptionally high level of abilities. At last, the protagonist saw his Esper and was horrified. He couldn't comprehend why Chakwan Wu lay there in such a dire condition. The protagonist inquired of the doctor what had happened to his Esper, and learned that he had been injured in a secondary explosion at the testing grounds. While Kim Do-won tried to understand what explosion the doctor was referring to, she asked him when he had last provided guidance to the Esper. He admitted it had been quite a while. When the doctor demanded an explanation, the protagonist hesitantly began recounting the circumstances. The woman invited him to her office where they could speak privately. She immediately informed him that Chakwan-woo's vital indicators had dropped dramatically. At that moment, the protagonist felt a terrible sense of relief, grateful that at least Chakwan-woo was still alive. The doctor escorted the protagonist to other specialists and relayed the information he had provided. Kim Do-won now saw his Esper up close. His condition was appalling, and the protagonist couldn't help but think that from outside, Chakwan-woo had seemed slightly better. The protagonist was laid down on a couch, speculating that the doctors might somehow extract energy from him to transfer to Chakwan-woo. He was eager to know how severe the Esper's injuries were and whether he could help him. His attention was drawn to the machines conducting measurements. The doctor addressed him, asking him to attempt providing guidance in his current position. A device resembling an IV drip was connected to him. A thin tube now linked their veins, transferring aid directly to the Esper. The specialist noted the first signs of improvement and decided to leave the two connected overnight. The protagonist doubted whether a mere few beeps from a machine could be considered progress. Suddenly, Kim Do-won felt a peculiar tingling sensation. The doctor explained to him that it was the stabilizer at work and reassured him not to worry. When he asked if the Esper would regain consciousness, she gave a positive response. Kim Do-won began to wonder how he would endure the anesthesia, knowing he didn't handle such procedures well. He tried to voice his concerns to the doctor, but fell into a deep sleep mid-sentence. The protagonist was so troubled by his state that even as he drifted out of sleep, he mumbled incoherently about the anesthesia. Finally, he opened his eyes. The doctor was nearby and informed him he had been asleep for 2 days. Kim Do-won asked the specialist if she was certain and whether she was truly referring to him. Then he glanced at the adjacent couch and found Chakwan-woo was no longer there. His greatest worry was that his efforts might have been in vain. A medical worker urged the protagonist to have a hearty lunch, but he was far more concerned about what had happened to his Esper. Still, he was required to eat before discussing the matter further with the doctor. The protagonist finished his meal, though he was tormented by the thought of why they hadn't informed him of anything and kept postponing the conversation. He got dressed and sat anxiously, unable to understand why he wasn't being called for a meeting. Finally, he was told to go to the 7th floor. He rushed there immediately, but as he left the room, an unfortunate incident occurred. A button popped off his shirt and rolled to the floor. The protagonist darkened with despair. He took the fact that the doctor's message had arrived at 4:44 a.m. combined with the lost button as a sinister omen. He tried to calm himself, assuring himself that nothing bad would happen. Yet he remained deeply distressed. He even cried over the fact that it hadn't rained that day to wash away the misfortune. In the end, he learned that Chakwan-woo had lost his abilities. The doctor clarified that, more precisely, the Esper had forgotten them. His amnesia spanned the period from when he joined the center at age 20 to the present. Kim Do-won tried to clarify the information, unable to believe his ears. The woman merely confirmed her words and added that such phenomena were not uncommon. She explained that it was a kind of reset. Espers eventually struggled to manage the surges of energy waves. As a result, the brain temporarily erases information about their abilities, allowing the body a chance to survive. The protagonist became utterly dejected. He asked the doctor whether there was any chance the Esper's abilities could return. The woman shook her head and explained that Chakwan-woo's memories and abilities were still stored somewhere within his body. The doctor likened it to a computer, where files are moved to the recycle bin. She emphasized that the real issue was that the Esper's memories, now in this so-called recycle bin, would remain there for no more than a month. She added that if they were not restored within that time frame, Chakwan-woo's abilities would be lost forever. And so, the doctor concluded that the protagonist was indispensable at this critical stage. It all culminated in the protagonist moving into his Esper's home. He was to stay by his side for an entire month. He still vividly recalled the doctor's words, comparing Chakwan-woo to a ticking time bomb, a crisis ready to erupt at any moment. The doctor then suggested looking at the Esper's indicators, which showed relative stability. Yet the protagonist saw no stability in those patterns. Regardless, he was instructed to remain constantly by the Esper's side, ready to provide guidance at a moment's notice. The protagonist immediately envisioned Chakwan-woo throwing him out of the house without hesitation, no matter how important the situation. He had no idea whether he could truly help his Esper during those 30 days, and felt certain the doctor overestimated his abilities. The protagonist was convinced that Chakwan-woo would hardly want to see him. Over 2 years of working together, he had felt like little more than a ghost to the Esper. He began chastising himself for frequently scolding the Esper and asking him to stop being such a bother. Then his attention shifted to the realization that he would be living in a large house, and he found himself uneasy in such a spacious environment. The protagonist suddenly imagined how furious Chakwan-woo must have been upon waking and realizing he had been set back 8 years. These thoughts left the young man ravenous. He headed to the kitchen and prepared a massive plate of fried rice with eggs, driven by the thought that, regardless of war, lunch must proceed on schedule. Midway through his second bite, he heard the front door open and froze, dreading what would happen when Chakwan-woo found him there. The protagonist resolved to act as if nothing had happened. He heard footsteps heading straight for the kitchen. Truthfully, he had clung to the hope that the Esper would go to his own room instead. The young man shrank into himself, eyes squeezed shut, bracing for the inevitable. Hearing nothing but silence, he cracked one eye open to assess the situation. His astonishment knew no bounds. Standing before him was someone who resembled both a young bear cub and Chakwan-woo. The young man greeted him. Then, with a radiant smile, he asked if he was correct in addressing Kim Do-won, the guide. The protagonist nearly dropped his jaw in disbelief, trying to comprehend if this was truly the same Chakwan-woo he thought he knew. Meanwhile, the brunette wished him a pleasant meal and casually mentioned he was heading to his room. The protagonist remained frozen, feverishly contemplating how the devil incarnate had seemingly transformed into a charming angel, greeting him with such warmth and kindness. He had never imagined events would unfold this way. When the protagonist called the doctor to discuss it, she explained that Chakwan-woo had also struggled to come to terms with everything, but eventually calmed down and assessed the situation rationally. She expressed her confidence that the Esper would regain his abilities and urged the protagonist to give it his utmost effort. The doctor added that she had emailed him several guidelines for effective and restorative guidance. The protagonist doubted whether anyone, no matter how strong-willed, could recall 8 years of memories in a single day. He opened the folder sent by the doctor and was momentarily taken aback. He had never been as confident in himself as the doctor seemed to be, and now his self-esteem had plummeted to an all-time low. The protagonist pondered what else he needed to learn. Suddenly, his watch alerted him. It was time for a guidance session. Grabbing his medical case, he rushed to the Esper's room. Determination surged through him. As he approached the room, he received a notification informing him that his salary for this work was set to increase 3- to 4-fold. Kim Do-won timidly peeked into the Esper's room. Chakwan-woo was sitting on the bed, engrossed in his work on the computer. The protagonist stepped forward, assuring himself that this was indeed the Chakwan-woo he had always known. The brunette finally noticed him and asked how he could be of assistance. The protagonist explained that he needed to perform daily guidance sessions, all the while catching himself struggling to adjust to the Esper's new appearance. Chakwan-woo, intrigued, began asking questions about the procedure. The protagonist, in turn, couldn't understand why Chakwan-woo was gazing at him so intently. The entire situation made Kim Do-won intensely uncomfortable. He started fidgeting nervously. The protagonist decided to begin by measuring the Esper's blood pressure. Yet he couldn't shake the overwhelming awkwardness he felt. Sensing his unease, Chakwan-woo took it upon himself to reassure him. The protagonist couldn't believe that this was how his Esper had been at 20 and struggled to fathom what could have happened to Chakwan-woo to bring about such a transformation. Chakwan-woo remarked that he was even willing to provide his body temperature readings. The protagonist continued to drift in the surreal haze of this incredible reality. The Esper asked what he was so intently pondering. The young man replied that it was nothing significant and resumed taking notes. Suddenly, Chakwan-woo asked if he understood correctly that since they had worked together for 2 years, they must have been friends. He added that he couldn't understand why the guide seemed so uneasy in his presence. At that moment, the protagonist thought that their relationship had been purely professional and, more often than not, emotionally bruising. Kim Do-won finally decided to tell him that the person he used to be was entirely different. When the brunette asked what the differences were, the protagonist confessed that the old him never spoke to him and kept his distance entirely. Chakwan-woo asked, incredulously, if he was sure they were talking about the same person. The protagonist simply stated that it was time to conduct the nightly guidance session. He asked the brunette to clear his mind and try not to think about anything. The Esper fixed his gaze on the protagonist, awaiting further instructions. The young man became completely flustered, wondering if something was on his face, like toothpaste. His nerves were so frazzled he even marveled at how loud his breathing sounded. Chakwan Wu occasionally inquired if he was doing everything correctly. Suddenly, the Esper insisted on a more intensive guidance session, claiming it might help restore his memory. The protagonist inwardly called the brunette a brazen opportunist. At one point, Kim Do-won heard a comment directed at him, suggesting that he knew too much and felt as if he were suffocating. When the words "I'll have to kill you" were spoken, the protagonist jolted awake. He stood up and began reassuring himself, declaring that he would succeed. Additionally, he reminded himself of the promised protection should things spiral out of control. Suddenly, he caught a scent in the air, and his empty stomach responded with a loud growl. Upon entering the living room, he encountered the brunette, who greeted him and admitted that he had been about to wake him up. On the table was a lavish breakfast, and the host mentioned that he had prepared it using his signature recipe. The protagonist immediately thought the portion was far too small for him, but appreciated how aesthetically pleasing it looked. Chakwan Wu informed Kim Do-won that he was diligently learning to do things the right way. The brunette modestly admitted that everything now felt like a first experience for him. Then, he hurried to reassure the protagonist that he was an exceptionally diligent student, confessing that he had always been nicknamed Sponge. When the protagonist shot him a questioning look, Chakwan Wu explained that he only needed to study something once to master it quickly. Kim Do-won was impressed by the delicious food prepared by his host. Chakwan Wu expressed his delight at the compliment and then asked how the protagonist usually addressed him. The brunette mentioned the official name and remarked that it sounded harsh and was cumbersome to pronounce. The protagonist didn't want to say it, but the former Chakwan Wu hadn't even known his name. Kim Do-won told him to address him in whatever way felt most natural. The Esper fell into thought. Then, he offered a casual nickname that left the protagonist utterly stunned. Kim Do-won blushed and exclaimed that such nicknames only appeared in movies, adding that during collaboration, people usually addressed each other as Guide and Esper. The protagonist was genuinely shocked, convinced that this guy had probably watched too many dramas. The brunette didn't argue, and instead informed Kim Do-won that he had his first training session today, suggesting he join him to observe. The protagonist hesitated for a moment before responding that he wouldn't mind attending the training. An hour later, the two were en route to the training facility. Along the way, the brunette suddenly remarked that perhaps asking him to accompany him had been a mistake. The protagonist was taken aback, wanting to point out that such doubts should have been voiced earlier, especially since he had an exam today. Inwardly, he cursed the Esper as a damn sunflower. And then that damn sunflower donned an innocent expression and admitted he was afraid of disappointing him. Chakwan Wu speculated that Kim Do-won probably only attended training sessions for S-class Espers. The protagonist countered, emphasizing that he didn't understand the source of such concern, especially since no one starts as a professional. To be honest, he had never attended any training sessions of the previous Chakwan Wu. The training base turned out to be an enormous structure where one could easily get lost. Chakwan Wu admired the grandeur of the building as if seeing it for the first time. The protagonist was puzzled since just last week. This place had practically been the Esper's second home. Chakwan Wu expressed a desire to wander around for a bit, but the protagonist reminded him they didn't have time and proceeded to the checkpoint. At the checkpoint, the protagonist informed the staff that he was accompanied by an Esper, who then began searching for his pass. The officer asked the brunette to undergo identity verification by placing his finger on a scanner and looking at the screen. Soon, the officer announced that the verification was complete and directed them to their destination. The protagonist glanced around and froze. The Esper was nowhere to be seen, and Kim Do-won began scanning the area for him. Now the protagonist tried to figure out where he had disappeared to. When he finally spotted the Esper, he wondered why he wasn't heading to the training session and why he was just standing there. The protagonist approached the brunette and asked what he was staring at. Chakwan Wu silently continued gazing at the screen, displaying his details and team affiliation. Kim Do-won grabbed his hand and dragged him toward the training room, emphasizing that this wasn't the time to dwell on memories. Once at the location, the protagonist opened a window, panting and desperate for a breath of fresh air. He glanced at the Esper and noticed that he didn't look particularly well. The protagonist decided not to interfere, especially since they weren't even friends. Yet no matter how much he told himself not to care, he couldn't help but pay attention to the Esper. The protagonist wondered if he should at least offer some words of support to Chakwan Wu before he left. However, he wasn't allowed inside due to safety regulations. The protagonist recalled the fearful expression on the brunette's face as he walked toward the training area. He abruptly halted his train of thought with a slap to his forehead, chastising himself for dwelling on unnecessary concerns. Just then, he noticed a woman standing nearby. He had heard before that espers could train independently of each other. The protagonist guessed that this woman had come to watch Chakwon-woo's training session. He couldn't help but wonder if she was curious to see how an esper who had lost his memory would perform. Then the woman struck him as vaguely familiar. Upon closer inspection, he noticed a flame insignia on her chest, indicating she was part of Chakwon-woo's team. The protagonist remembered seeing her with a group of espers conversing at the guidance center. He continued observing her. Suddenly, the woman addressed him by name and asked if she had correctly guessed that he was Chakwon-woo's guide. When Kim Do-won asked how she knew his name, the woman replied that, in their branch, there wasn't a single esper who didn't know Chakwon-woo's guide. She added that it couldn't be otherwise. Especially considering how much he had helped his esper, the woman quickly became talkative, eager to learn how the protagonist had managed to save Chakwon-woo's life. Her curiosity persisted, and this time she asked if it was true that Chakwon-woo was as obedient as a lamb while at the guidance center. The protagonist was openly stunned, unable to comprehend the rumors surrounding them as he recalled his encounters with the esper. He informed her, however, that just last week, the esper had thrown him into the corridor. The woman laughed even harder and jokingly asked if he had miraculously escaped with all his bones intact. She expressed surprise at Chakwon-woo's behavior. The protagonist couldn't believe someone was engaging with him simply because he hadn't been left with broken ribs, especially considering he had been living like a stray dog all this time. Still, he responded that he had no idea where all these rumors had originated. The woman asked how things were currently between him and Chakwon-woo. She clarified her question by inquiring how Chakwon-woo, now back in his 20-year-old state, was behaving. The protagonist gave her a suspicious look, unsure of her interest. Meanwhile, Chakwon-woo was stepping onto the training field. The protagonist eventually replied that his esper had become an entirely different person, and even spoke to him now. He then confessed to the woman that he hadn't yet adapted to this new dynamic. She remarked that she could now recognize the 20-year-old Chakwon-woo. The protagonist hastened to ask if his esper had truly been like this before, and what had caused such a drastic change in him. The woman explained that battles bring about various circumstances, inevitably altering one's character. She even admitted that she herself had changed for the worse, mentioning that she used to avoid swearing but now couldn't do without it. The protagonist suddenly wondered who might find profanity amusing. Then he grew curious about what kind of training session his esper was scheduled for today. The woman suggested that it would be easier to simply watch the screen. Behind the glass appeared a monstrous creature. The protagonist's face darkened at the sight of the beast, and he asked what on earth it was. His companion replied that the creature was classified as an E-level demon, ideal for training low-level espers. The protagonist asked incredulously if such bizarre creatures were really used for training. As the woman began to explain, he pointed toward the field at another strange monster. Kim Do-won asked if she meant to say that the monster was, in fact, a robot. It turned out that through their augmented vision, espers saw the same terrifying creatures displayed on the screen. Meanwhile, the demon roared loudly and charged forward. Kim Do-won covered his ears, feeling genuinely terrified. The monster menacingly rushed toward Chakwon-woo. At one point, it nearly reached its target. The demon struck the ground with immense force, causing it to crack and hurling massive rocks in all directions. Along with the debris, Chakwon-woo was flung aside. The protagonist suddenly asked his companion how his esper could possibly handle such a monster without activated abilities. The woman countered by asking if he had ever heard of the flea experiment. The protagonist admitted he had not. She then explained that the experiment demonstrated how environment and habits could impose limitations. Chakwon-woo, meanwhile, was desperately trying to save his skin. The woman explained that fleas only jump to a certain height, believing it impossible to go higher. The demon launched another attack on the brunette. The woman continued, adding that if fleas' lives were endangered by placing fire beneath the jar, they would leap higher out of fear of death. It seemed Chakwon-woo had managed to repel the attack, though he could no longer remain on his feet. The woman remarked that everyone has a will to survive. She drew a parallel to what was happening behind the glass, suggesting to the protagonist that it was as if Chakwon-woo was standing over a literal fire. Now, the esper needed to leap higher than ever before. The protagonist thought to himself that it was one thing for a flea or a grasshopper, but he feared this might kill Chakwan Wu. Suddenly he shouted that his flea, then quickly corrected himself, saying his esper was clearly on the brink of death. The woman reassured him, saying it might look painful, but the floor was made of cushioning material designed to be nearly harmless. The protagonist suddenly remembered rumors that a kind of bond forms between an esper and a guide who frequently conducts guidance sessions. Chakwan Wu continued fending off the demon's relentless attacks. It was becoming unbearable for the protagonist to watch the esper behind the glass, being battered like popcorn in a microwave. He voiced his opinion that the training session should be stopped immediately. The woman calmly replied that there was no need to worry, as the pain felt on the field was significantly diminished. Finally, the system announced a blue code, signaling that the training had concluded. The protagonist ran toward his esper, from afar convinced that Chakwan Wu was gravely injured. Halfway there, he stopped, realizing he had gotten lost in the massive facility and didn't know where to find his esper. He decided to use his watch to locate Chakwan Wu. This was possible because an esper and their assigned guide could pinpoint each other's locations anywhere in the world. On one hand, this function was incredibly convenient. On the other, with an esper like the old Chakwan Wu, one could expect calls 24/7. Right now, the protagonist didn't care about that. He was focused on finding his flea, who had almost been turned into popcorn. He managed to track the esper's location, but the signal came from the opposite side of the enormous complex. Cursing under his breath, he rushed in the indicated direction. At last, he found the correct door. However, he was met with an unexpected sight: a doctor standing guard. The woman demanded that he present his pass. Once the doctor confirmed everything was in order, she directed the protagonist to the room where the guidance procedure would take place. Kim Do-won suddenly realized that a blue code signified a relatively low level of danger. Even so, he had been incredibly stressed. On the other hand, he couldn't imagine reacting any differently after watching an esper being thrown around and hurt. Kim Do-won was astonished to find Chakwan Wu completely unharmed, as if he hadn't just been battling a monstrous demon. The protagonist dryly commented that it seemed the esper didn't require his help after all. Chakwan Wu replied that he wouldn't mind having his guidance 365 days a year. The protagonist, meanwhile, fumed at himself for being so gullibly deceived. Kim Do-won decided to ask how the esper was feeling. Chakwan Wu simply replied that all he wanted was to leave this place. The next day arrived. The protagonist prepared himself breakfast and ate it while pondering whether Chakwan Wu was still asleep. Then, he began chastising himself for worrying unnecessarily. Yet the question of why the esper hadn't come out for breakfast continued to gnaw at him. Kim Do-won suddenly recalled a situation at university when his deskmate was asleep, leaving him torn over whether to wake them or not. He also wondered if there were really people who valued sleep more than food. He continued to mull over why Chakwan Wu hadn't emerged yet, especially since he had already eaten, washed the dishes, tidied up the living room, showered, watched television, and still, there was no sign of him. Finally, the protagonist stood resolutely and headed to Chakwan Wu's room, driven by the thought that he needed to check on the esper's condition regardless. He grabbed his medical kit, knocked on the door, and announced that he was coming in. The protagonist reasoned that even if Chakwan Wu was asleep, he could quickly check on him and leave. But the room was empty. The protagonist assumed the esper had gone to the bathroom. When he knocked there, no one responded either. At last, Kim Do-won found Chakwan Wu. The brunette was simply standing in front of a mirror, silently staring at his reflection. The protagonist admitted that he had been startled, then curiously asked what he was doing there. Chakwan Wu gave him an odd look, deepening the protagonist's suspicion that something was wrong. Suddenly, Chakwan Wu said he wanted to leave this place. He repeated his desire again. Then, to the protagonist's shock, the esper began to cry. Chakwan Wu poured out his feelings, saying that just yesterday he felt like a nobody until he opened his eyes. He couldn't understand why he remembered nothing, while everyone insisted he had been a great, composed individual. The protagonist recalled the doctor's words about how Chakwan Wu had quickly calmed down and assessed the situation rationally. The esper continued, saying people claimed he had never given up in the face of challenges and that he needed to return to his former self. The protagonist heard the brunette admit that he was quite frankly scared. As he opened up further, Chakwan Wu confessed he had checked his phone and found no familiar names. It felt as if everyone had abandoned him in an unfamiliar place. He told the protagonist he didn't know what to do or how to move forward. Kim Do-won fully empathized with the brunette's feelings, understanding the immense burden he was carrying. But the Esper still needed to make a choice. Time was moving on. Cha Kwan-woo now faced two options: either adapt to the changed circumstances or recover his memory and reclaim his former self. The protagonist had learned that lower-level Espers often lost control due to mental limitations rather than physical ones. Now that Cha Kwan-woo was an F-level Esper, the protagonist was deeply concerned about his overall state. He decided to check the Esper's vitals, but the readings gave no response, leading him to suspect his gadget had frozen. After waiting for the system to update, it displayed results so alarming that the protagonist was left at a loss. Cha Kwan-woo continued to berate himself, calling himself talentless, unnecessary, strange, and incapable. The protagonist sat him down, trying to calm him. While the brunette lamented his uselessness, the protagonist racked his brain, wondering how to handle this depressive sunflower. Eventually, he grabbed a box of tissues. Dabbing the Esper's tears, he reflected on what could have possibly happened to transform the once self-assured Cha Kwan-woo into this. The protagonist urged the brunette to listen carefully, explaining that he was helping him because he feared he might do something reckless. In truth, the protagonist was gravely worried about his Esper's condition, dreading the possibility of him taking his own life. He also feared the consequences for himself, being arrested and imprisoned for negligence and complicity in the death of an Esper. Suddenly, the protagonist sensed that Cha Kwan-woo was beginning to regain his composure. He glanced at the readings and noticed that all the curves were perfectly balanced. The protagonist curiously asked the brunette how he was feeling. Cha Kwan-woo requested his help once more to solidify the results. In response, the protagonist showed him the data as proof and added that no further intervention from him was necessary. Cha Kwan-woo fixed his gaze on the screen of Kim Do-won's watch. When he asked what it was, the protagonist explained that it was an application displaying notifications and guidance metrics. Cha Kwan-woo was visibly surprised by this information. The protagonist elaborated that he was required to receive such data since he was responsible for him. At the same time, Kim Do-won noted to himself that the Esper seemed much more at ease now, as even his expression had brightened. Cha Kwan-woo asked if it was possible to set up something similar on his own watch. Kim Do-won attempted to configure the brunette's device. However, biometric verification prevented him from accessing the Esper's smartwatch, so he simply explained how to find the relevant menu. The protagonist demonstrated step by step how everything worked. Feeling awkward again, he noticed that Cha Kwan-woo now wanted to learn about the other features of his watch. The protagonist explained that his own device was specifically designed for Espers, so he wasn't familiar with its full functionality. Meanwhile, Kim Do-won discovered that Cha Kwan-woo's pulse had significantly quickened. The protagonist grew tense and urged the Esper to take a deep breath in and out. When the Esper replied that it wouldn't help, Kim Do-won insisted on proper deep breathing. Cha Kwan-woo began to worry about his rapidly beating heart, to which the protagonist retorted that everyone's heart beats. It's perfectly normal. He continued to press for compliance with his recommendations. Meanwhile, the Esper discovered he could track the guide's location and even send him messages using his smartwatch. The protagonist warned that such functions should only be used in emergencies. He further explained their usage and suggested adding his contact to the favorites list. Cha Kwan-woo asked Kim Do-won to do the same. The protagonist hesitated, reasoning that if Cha Kwan-woo regained his memory and saw him in the favorites list, it could lead to trouble. Cha Kwan-woo then asked for help removing all other contacts from his favorites. Kim Do-won pointed out that those might be important individuals since they were already in the list. The brunette replied that he trusted only him at the moment and wanted to simplify things. The protagonist thought Cha Kwan-woo might regret this decision later but decided not to interfere. In truth, Kim Do-won feared the potential fallout from the Esper's eventual temper. Cha Kwan-woo asked why he couldn't delete some contacts. The protagonist explained that it was likely because those people were currently offline, perhaps on vacation or retired. Eventually, Cha Kwan-woo succeeded, leaving only Kim Do-won in his favorites list. The protagonist grew increasingly uneasy, imagining the wrath of Cha Kwan-woo if things went awry. Meanwhile, the brunette was as jubilant as a child. The protagonist sternly told the Esper to remember that he had personally added his name to the favorites list. The next day, the protagonist went to university. He was deeply upset by everything that had transpired, considering it a complete failure. He mused that it might have been better to score 0 points outright. It would have at least spared his pride. Suddenly, he received a message from the Esper asking when his classes would end. Devastated, the protagonist thought to himself that the last thing he needed was to deal with this sunflower now. Yet the messages kept coming. The protagonist regretted 100 times over teaching Chakwan Wu how to use these functions. He was exasperated that the brunette instantly replied to his messages and kept sending more. Then, out of nowhere, he heard the Esper's voice, saying he would wait for him there so they could go to his training together. To begin with, the protagonist headed to a meeting with his professor, who casually inquired whether he had ever been emotionally attached to someone. Kim Do-won was so startled by the question that he dropped his cookie. The professor went on to say that he had been reviewing his work and wanted to know if the young man had any real understanding of love. At that moment, the protagonist realized his mistake, thinking it was obvious that the professor wouldn't invite him over just to share dessert. Receiving no answer, the professor expressed his disapproval of the student writing about love without ever having experienced it. The professor began explaining that, before embarking on such a topic, one must endure a breakup, survive its aftermath with difficulty, experience heartache, cry oneself to sleep, and only then begin to create. The protagonist realized that at this rate, he wouldn't make it to his Esper's training and thought he should send a message, though it would be inappropriate to do so in front of the professor. Suddenly, he noticed an incoming call on his watch. The protagonist wondered if something had happened to the Esper. He interrupted the professor, explaining that he was being urgently summoned. The professor didn't hold him back and advised him to focus on his personal life during the holidays. The protagonist received another call and started to think that perhaps an emergency had occurred. He barely had time to answer the call before hearing the voice of his Esper. A very pleased Chakwan Wu greeted Kim Do-won. The protagonist was utterly bewildered, unable to comprehend how the Esper had ended up there. Chakwan Wu replied that the app helping him locate his guide had been useful. Frowning, the protagonist asked if he had completely lost his mind. Kim Do-won was deeply upset that the Esper was using the watch's features so recklessly, especially since he hadn't taught him for such purposes. When he asked Chakwan Wu what he was doing there, the Esper replied that he had been bored at home. The protagonist scowled again, deeply annoyed that the Esper not only distracted him with calls, but also tracked his location. He reminded him that such functions were meant for emergencies. Chakwan Wu calmly asserted that for him, this had been an emergency. When Kim Do-won asked what the so-called emergency had been, he learned that the Esper had been miserably lonely in the massive house. The fridge had been making an annoying noise, and the high ceilings were unsettling. The protagonist reminded the brunette yet again that such reasons didn't justify using those features. Chakwan Wu disagreed, saying the reasons were far from insignificant. The protagonist still couldn't fathom how the Esper had decided to track him down. Chakwan Wu admitted that he hadn't initially planned to come inside, but after waiting 5 minutes without seeing him, he decided to act. The Esper asked the protagonist not to be angry with him, citing that he felt utterly alone in this world. Kim Do-won looked at the Esper's puppy dog expression and wondered how it had come to this. Mentally, the protagonist justified the Esper by finding several valid reasons and suggested they leave the place. The two stepped outside. The protagonist caught himself thinking that it wasn't even the height of summer, yet the heat was already sweltering. Chakwan Wu decided to ask if the protagonist harbored any resentment toward him. The protagonist didn't want to delve into that topic, so he simply walked ahead. The Esper hurried to catch up with his guide, convinced that he bore him no ill will. The protagonist glanced at the brunette and suddenly wondered what he might be thinking about. Chakwan Wu, as if reading his mind, began talking about how the university campus looked enormous and admitted that he had once wanted to enroll in a similar institution. He then shared that a week before he was supposed to apply, he received a notification from the center. The message stated that based on the results of the first stage of testing, he had been identified as an Esper and was requested to come to the center for the second stage of evaluation. The protagonist recalled that when he received his own notification, his heart had sunk. Now he asked the Esper how he had felt upon hearing the news. The brunette replied that he had felt somewhat uneasy, as there was no one in his circle who had ever received such a letter. He added that even his parents hadn't believed it at first and had sent him to the second stage of testing to confirm. Suddenly, Chakwan Wu asked the protagonist what he was doing there. Kim Do-won immediately panicked, fearing the brunette might be entertaining dark thoughts again. He quickly invited him to have lunch together. Now he was racking his brain, unsure where to take the Esper. On top of that, he didn't know of any good spots nearby and hadn't yet figured out Chakwan Wu's food preferences. The protagonist's mind went into overdrive. Ultimately, he came up with nothing and grew even more frustrated by the fact that he didn't even have anyone to ask for advice. Unexpectedly, the situation resolved itself. Chakwan Wu chose a place to grab a bite on his own. They ended up at a diner where the protagonist had often eaten during his high school days. However, he couldn't understand why they had chosen a place that exclusively served spicy food. The protagonist decided to immediately bring some water, but Chakwan Wu volunteered to do it himself. In fact, the Esper took it upon himself to handle the order entirely, asking the protagonist to sit and wait. Kim Do-won found it rather peculiar to watch the Esper in this diner. At the same time, he noticed that the other patrons couldn't take their eyes off Chakwan Wu. The protagonist speculated that it might be due to the way he referred to him as a guide, or perhaps because of his imposing physique. Chakwan Wu invited him to choose a side dish. The protagonist immediately looked at the menu and asked the Esper if he could handle spicy food well. Chakwan Wu responded in such a way as to imply he always ate extremely spicy food. The protagonist refused to back down. He declared that he, too, enjoyed spicy dishes. Finally, a plate of food was placed in front of him, every molecule of it screaming of intense pepper concentration. The Esper boldly began devouring the dish. The protagonist was left dumbfounded, his jaw practically dropping at the sight. Determined not to fall behind, he resolved to keep up, despite fearing that such an attempt might be fatal. He shoveled a portion into his mouth and hastily swallowed it. His entire body trembled, and he felt as though he might burst into flames. He couldn't help but think that those who enjoyed such fiery flavors must have masochistic tendencies. Chakwan Wu, observing his struggle, suggested that perhaps the protagonist didn't handle spicy food well. Through tears, the protagonist shouted that this was absolutely not the case. Chakwan Wu called for the waiter to bring them some rice balls. The side dish was promptly served. The protagonist eagerly stuffed the rice into his mouth to dilute the scorching heat of the food he had consumed. Chakwan Wu handed Kim Do-won a plate of eggs, asking him to eat them as well. The protagonist thought to himself that the Esper must be an angel to offer him his eggs. He quickly devoured them too. But then he froze. He suddenly wondered whether Chakwan Wu had truly lost his memory, or if he had simply gone mad. After lunch, the two stepped outside and sat at a table while waiting for their ride to arrive. The protagonist was eating ice cream, thinking that nothing calmed the stomach after spicy food quite like a cold dessert. He didn't care that Chakwan Wu insisted eating ice cream under the blazing sun was a mistake. The protagonist asked the Esper to stop giving him judgmental looks, but the latter reminded him that if he dawdled, the dessert would melt and stain his clothes. He knew this himself, but simply couldn't eat any faster. Suddenly, Chakwan Wu sprang to his feet. While the protagonist watched the Esper, his ice cream began to drip. Chakwan Wu approached and, in one swift motion, ate the entire thing. The protagonist panicked, demanding to know why the Esper had eaten his ice cream. Chakwan Wu calmly replied that it would have been a waste to let it go. The protagonist was left in a daze, utterly confused. Chakwan Wu explained that sharing was perfectly normal. Finally, the protagonist snapped out of his shock and silenced the Esper, refusing to listen to his foolish justifications. What followed was a dialogue in which the protagonist struggled to get his point across, while the sunflower remained convinced he had done nothing wrong. Kim Do-won was exasperated, frustrated that his attempts to explain things clearly were being completely misunderstood. Suddenly, the Esper fell silent, and the guide began worrying again about his mental state. At last, Chakwan Wu declared that it was utterly disheartening to hear about how he had supposedly been in the past. He proclaimed that since he had no knowledge of who he used to be, he preferred to live as his current self. The protagonist was slightly confused. To him, the old Chakwan Wu and the current one were the same person. The Esper concluded by stating that he was upset. When the protagonist tried to understand the reason for his distress, the brunette asked him to work exclusively with him from now on. Kim Do-won was now utterly perplexed. The protagonist chose to remain silent. Suddenly, his smartwatch buzzed to life. When he glanced at the screen, he saw a notification stating that the Esper's pulse was spiking. The protagonist quickly inquired how Chakwan Wu was feeling, referring to the alert. Chakwan Wu curiously asked if he could also monitor the protagonist's pulse. Kim Do-won couldn't understand why he would need such information. He seated Chakwan Wu in the car, explaining that this feature wasn't available to Espers. The protagonist followed and got into the vehicle as well. They soon arrived at the guidance center for the Esper's training session. The two parted ways at the door Chakwon-woo was to enter. Suddenly, the Esper admitted to his guide that he was scared. The protagonist reassured him, explaining that today's session was a mental exercise and there was nothing to fear. He deduced that the previous training session must have deeply unsettled Chakwon-woo. The protagonist did his best to calm the Esper, encouraging him to proceed. Chakwon-woo comforted himself with the thought that no matter what happened, his guide would surely help him. Kim Do-won practically ushered the Esper into the training hall. Chakwon-woo requested that his guide wait for him. The protagonist was uncertain, unsure how best to handle the situation. In the waiting room, he noticed an unfamiliar blonde man. The stranger, however, not only recognized him, but even knew his name and that he was Chakwon-woo's guide. Kim Do-won asked the blonde how he knew so much about him. The man replied that the protagonist was quite well known due to his partnership with Chakwon-woo. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that everyone seemed to be part of some secret chat group to which he hadn't been invited. The blonde remarked that today's session would be challenging for Chakwon-woo. Chakwon-woo was placed on a couch and restrained. He was visibly anxious. The protagonist noticed this and doubted whether his Esper could overcome his fears. The blonde began recounting a similar story from 3 years ago. The protagonist grew even more nervous. The blonde shared that he had always imagined Chakwon-woo as a panther, jaguar, or some other powerful feline. But then he admitted that, on closer inspection, the Esper resembled a small fish. The protagonist immediately recalled calling his Esper a sunflower and felt a surge of anger toward the blonde. He firmly told the blonde that while his Esper might not look intimidating, his abilities were undeniably impressive. Their debate was interrupted by the doctor, who entered the room. She announced that the training would soon begin, but first they needed to review some safety precautions. The doctor reminded the observers that under no circumstances should they leave the safe zone, even if they received an emergency call. She warned the blonde to be mindful, as Chakwon-woo might target his Esper. The specialist informed her colleagues over the phone that the session could begin. An unfamiliar Esper approached Chakwon-woo, initiating mental influence. Kim Do-won felt tense at first. After 10 minutes, he began to relax, and by 15 minutes, he was completely at ease. After 30 minutes, the protagonist realized to his surprise that everything felt dreadfully dull. He had expected something more intense, possibly even a confrontation. Yet the session was proceeding sluggishly. Chakwon-woo's tranquil demeanor had a calming effect on him. The protagonist thought how wonderful it would be if even a fragment of the Esper's memory returned this time. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a loud noise. The protagonist could no longer see Chakwon-woo. The glass was now obscured by thick smoke. The protagonist shot up from his seat. He couldn't see Chakwon-woo and had no idea where he had gone. The blonde was equally alarmed by what was unfolding behind the glass. Eventually, they managed to spot the other Esper lying crumpled on the floor. The system blared an emergency alert, instructing all center Espers to report to room 902. The protagonist caught himself momentarily forgetting who Chakwon-woo truly was. Espers rushed into the room and found their mentally trained colleague suspended from the ceiling, encircled by Chakwon-woo. Such power could only belong to one of the 2 S-level Espers in the country. Chakwon-woo's gaze now carried an entirely different intensity. The protagonist shuddered, realizing that Chakwon-woo had most likely regained his memory. The blonde snapped the protagonist back to reality by asking what he was staring at. The man demanded that Kim Do-won stop his Esper immediately. The protagonist saw that not even other Espers could restrain Chakwon-woo. Suddenly, they heard someone commanding Chakwon-woo to stand still. The other Esper remained suspended and writhing within the telekinetic ring. The protagonist briefly wondered whether Chakwon-woo would save him if the situation were reversed. Shaking off his thoughts, he made a call to his Esper. Chakwon-woo simply stared at his smartwatch. Then his gaze shifted directly to Kim Do-won. The protagonist shuddered again, utterly terrified, as he hadn't seen Chakwon-woo look so menacing in a long time. Suddenly, someone fired a tranquilizer dart at the Esper. The dart found its target. Chakwon-woo grabbed it and yanked it out of his neck. However, the substance had already taken effect, and the Esper's head began to spin. Within seconds, he collapsed helplessly to the floor. The system announced that the Esper suppression was complete and the red level alert had been lifted. The protagonist was offered tea to help calm his nerves. The doctor met with him again and asked how he was feeling. Kim Do-won gave a brief response before inquiring about his Esper's condition. The doctor regretfully informed him that Chakwon-woo's memory had not returned. She speculated that the training session had likely triggered memories Chakwon-woo didn't want others to uncover, explaining that such suppressed memories often lead to aggression. The doctor expressed relief that the protagonist had been present to calm the Esper, enabling them to suppress his outburst. Kim Do-won retorted that it was the dart, not him, that had calmed the Esper. The woman explained that Cha Kwon-woo specialized in telekinesis and had achieved the highest level in that ability. She asked whether he truly believed that Cha Kwon-woo couldn't have stopped the dart if he had wanted to. The protagonist recalled the state and expression of his Esper. The doctor added that Cha Kwon-woo had consciously lowered his defenses the moment Kim Do-won called out to him. She emphasized that Kang Joo-hee had seized the opportunity to act while everyone else was paralyzed with shock. At that moment, the protagonist felt a wave of chills run from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. The doctor informed him that his assistance would be needed in the future to help restore Cha Kwon-woo's memory. The protagonist learned that the specialists intended to continue stimulating the Esper's suppressed memories to achieve positive progress. The woman admitted that what had happened today would not be an isolated incident and asked the guide to monitor the guidance sessions closely. The protagonist agreed, but only on the condition that he be given 3 bottles of alcohol first. The doctor was taken aback by the statement, but managed to ask why he needed 3 bottles. Laughing, the protagonist replied that it was merely a joke. The woman didn't appreciate his humor at all. A few hours later, Kim Do-won was preparing for bed, still analyzing the doctor's words. He went to check on the sleeping Cha Kwon-woo, knowing the Esper would need at least 24 hours to recover. For some reason, the protagonist imagined his Esper might be plagued by nightmares. He once again recalled the harrowing fragments of today's training session. The protagonist concluded that Cha Kwon-woo's expression had been one of someone forced to confront memories they desperately wanted to keep hidden. Cha Kwon-woo continued to sleep deeply. The protagonist lay down on his bed and realized how incredible the mattress was. He even entertained the thought of buying one for himself. With that thought, he drifted into his own slumber. Soon the protagonist woke up, burdened by the thought of how heavy everything felt. To make matters worse, someone was knocking on the door. He couldn't fathom who it might be. It was none other than Kang Joo-hee. The protagonist immediately asked her why she was there and what had happened to her face. The woman replied that she hadn't slept in 2 days. The protagonist assumed she likely hadn't eaten either. Kang Joo-hee responded that if she didn't have time to sleep, there was certainly no time to eat. The protagonist invited her inside and offered her a banana. Kang Joo-hee shoved the whole banana into her mouth. Kim Do-won tried to stop her, pointing out that she needed to peel it first. The woman ignored this and instead asked how Cha Kwon-woo was doing. She was told he was fine. Kang Joo-hee requested that when Cha Kwon-woo woke up, the protagonist tell him never to treat the precious captain that way again, and to show him respect and care in the future. She emphasized that special attention must be paid to preserving the captain's face, calling it a national treasure. The protagonist didn't even bother stopping the redhead when she bit into another banana peel. Moreover, Kang Joo-hee constantly mispronounced the protagonist's name, which annoyed him greatly. She then remarked that he cared for his Esper as tenderly as a mother hedgehog cares for her young. She added that there was only one thing in this world she truly hated. Kang Joo-hee pointed to her arm, where a bandage hung loosely. She began recounting how she had never wanted to wear a bandage and had always avoided duties and responsibilities since childhood. Now, however, she was forced to carry out the obligations of a captain, a role she had never aspired to. Kang Joo-hee admitted that her lifelong dream had been world peace, but that dream had since changed. She confessed that now she longed for Cha Kwon-woo's memory to return so he could reclaim the leader's bandage from her. Falling to her knees, she begged the protagonist to help her. He replied that there was nothing he could do. The moment she took the protagonist's hand in hers, she was overwhelmed with excitement. She immediately sensed the strength emanating from him and admitted that she envied Cha Kwon-woo for being partnered with someone like him. At that moment, the Esper entered the room and curtly asked the woman to remove her hands from his guide. The protagonist noticed the sudden change in Cha Kwon-woo's expression and wondered how it was possible, considering he had been sound asleep just minutes earlier. Kang Joo-hee suddenly burst into uncontrollable laughter, leaving the two men utterly perplexed. Mentally, the protagonist advised her that if she valued her life, she should stop laughing immediately. Chakwan Wu abruptly asked Kang Ju-hee who she was. She introduced herself, explaining that she was temporarily performing his duties. The atmosphere in the room turned tense, like two wild animals squaring off. Chakwan Wu then demanded to know why she had come. Kang Ju-hee replied that she had wanted to admire the protagonist's face, winking at him as she said so. Chakwan Wu asked why she was so interested in his guide's face. Kang Ju-hee declared that he was handsome and that her current life was so full of pain that she needed a little distraction. Hence her visit. Cha Kwan-woo coldly told her that if she had admired the protagonist's face enough, she could now leave his house. Kang Ju-hee asked Kim Do-won to escort her out. Before he could even respond, Kang Ju-hee yanked him away from the panther's grasp and placed him firmly in front of her. She launched into another impassioned speech about her dedication to her work and her unwavering commitment, trying to appeal to his goodwill to help her shed the burden of leadership. The protagonist asked her directly what she was planning. She replied that she needed a little motivation. The protagonist, completely baffled, tried to clarify her meaning. Their conversation was hindered by Cha Kwan-woo's presence, as he glared at the guest with a smoldering intensity. Kang Ju-hee suddenly struck the metal door with her fist, and the protagonist thought he heard the crunch of her bones. Regaining her composure, she suggested that they meet again under calmer circumstances. The door slammed shut behind Kang Ju-hee, leaving Kim Do-won to puzzle over what had just happened. Cha Kwan-woo began interrogating him, demanding to know why random women were entering his home while he slept. Before the protagonist could respond, Cha Kwan-woo fired another question, asking if he regularly provided guidance to other espers alongside him. Kim Do-won couldn't get a word in, overwhelmed by his esper's barrage of accusations. Cha Kwan-woo once again insisted that the protagonist not offer guidance to anyone else while working with him. A frustrated Kim Do-won finally retorted that he hadn't helped and wasn't helping anyone but him.